Alright, how is everyone doing today? Welcome to my channel. It's an educational channel, and we try to dig into great theories of everything, all-encompassing theories, earth-shattering theories, cosmologies, magnum opuses, tour de forces, and we try to kind of walk you through some of the more difficult ones because I know that such a thing can be very daunting. And we hope it helps you like it helped me with my paradigm shifting and my awakening to 5D consciousness, my formation of holistic worldview. Still got a long way to go. And my quest for better spiritual, mental, and physical health. But today's our 223rd video on the Reciprocal Church, which is something that expresses the appreciation of Dewey B. Larson for his reciprocal system of theory, which is really the first unified theory that goes into great detail in so many different subjects. I've done about almost 600 videos on the reciprocal system, so if you want to check back in the archives, at least on BitChute and on YouTube, all my videos are there, and most of it is just going over the text of many of Dewey Larson's books and articles and so forth from Larson and some of his followers. So check that out if you're curious. But for the Reciprocal Church, Larson was also able to unite science and religion. And so we are attempting to kind of syncretically put together a spiritual praxis for people, giving them the spiritual resources that they need to, set up their own spiritual life in the vacuum that's going to be created as soon as we all accept the inevitable, figure out that Christianity and Judaism are both frauds. But in particular, we're looking at Christianity today, or for the last several, probably 50 videos. And that the New Testament was written entirely by the Romans, the Caesars, and their followers, their immediate families, and their court, their royal court of experts. In particular, a guy named Josephus, who was actually a guy named Arius Calpurnius Piso. And if you read Josephus's book called Wars of the Jews, it covers this war from 66 to 73 AD between the Romans and the Jews. Josephus claims to have been a general in the Jewish army who eventually surrendered to Vespasian, the Roman general. And at that point, he had an epiphany that God no longer favors the Jews, he favors the Romans, and he defected to the Romans. And he also gave Vespasian the star prophecy saying that someday I foresee that you are going to become the new emperor of Rome. And when Vespasian did become the new emperor, Josephus was pardoned by Vespasian, adopted as a member of his family, and brought to Rome as one of the court historians. And he wrote this Jewish war with the full, endorsement of, in particular, Titus, Vespasian's son, who, when Vespasian became the new emperor, Titus became the new general. And Titus eventually became emperor as well. And so Titus and Vespasian and Titus's brother Domitian are called the Flavian emperors from 69 to 96 AD, and they backdated Jesus' story, Jesus' story, and had him prophesy all kinds of events that were to occur. Many Christians believe that these events still have not occurred. But if you read the War of the Jews by Josephus, you will see that Titus fulfills all of Jesus' prophecies there in the first century. And when Jesus, predicts something is going to happen symbolically, Titus fulfills it literally. So there's no wiggle room. It's like Titus does it absolutely to the letter. And this is all a mind trap for the Jews, that's who the Romans were targeting for this, because the Jews were fighting against the Romans over and over again, insurrecting and revolting, and they wanted to mellow them out. They eventually used it on the Gentiles and other Romans as well, but and those were really what Paul's epistles are about. But the Gospels are mainly targeted at the Jews. And if you read Josephus next to or in unison with the Gospels, especially with the book of Luke, as our author Michael Menescotts does here, you'll see that there, even just in the book of Luke, there are like 250 parallels. And Menescotts maps those out or graphs them on a plot with the book of Luke, chapters 1 through 24 on one axis, and Josephus's Jewish war, paragraphs 1 through 700 or so on the horizontal axis. And when doing so, plotting all the points of the parallels, it doesn't just create a random pattern, it creates 5 letters in Latin, APTVS. I believe that stands for Arius Piso, Titus Vespasianus. The TVS part, I think, is a no-brainer because TVS is an imprint that Titus and Vespasian put on Roman coins that you can still find. TVS. But the AP part, I believe, refers to Arius Piso. He talks about Agia Pneuma and some other things. That would be the Holy Spirit. And, that is certainly part of the Christian things to turn this monotheism into a tritheism kind of thing, a trinity, which they still call monotheism. But, the level of, evasion is so unbelievable that, any type of rationalization is not a surprise to me. So Menescotts is here. He's kind of summarizing his work, which, I highly recommend that you buy this book. It's called Christianity's Origins, Flavian Secrecy Cult by Michael Menescotts, Menasgotz, and it just came out like 3 months ago, and it is, detailed and thorough, but, I have various qualms about some of the things that are going on here. He summarizes his work over and over again, and he's just moving very, very slowly through the material, and it's very cumbersome and not very lively. It's a pretty technical read. So that being said, this kind of channel, that's what this is about, is to go through very difficult reads. When somebody is articulating a new thing, something that not everybody else has already articulated, they often had to come up with a new language, new phrases, new ways to express things. And so the level of articulation sometimes isn't quite as high as if somebody is working on a topic, just polishing off a topic that's already been combed through. So you have to be able to have that level of tolerance for, things that maybe aren't, on a silver platter for you. they can't roll out the red carpet for you because they're just trying to get it down and document it at all. So, so let's start here with his summary, and we'll see where he goes. Okay, so he's pretty much trying to go over his theory that the Christianity was a Roman Flavian, the emperors, the dynasty Flavian secrecy cult, meaning that at first the idea was to get you into Jesus, then to get you into Jesus as a God, and then to get you to recognize that actually, well, Jesus is more of a prophet, and he's more predicting the second coming of himself as Titus, a generation later, and then gradually to get you to drop the whole Jesus thing, and now you're just pure emperor worship. So that's kind of his thesis, or his idea of why the Romans did this. Okay, and so he's going to compare his theory with mythicism, basically the idea that the Jesus story is a combination of many different myths from different groups of people in the past, and it's just kind of an amalgamation. Okay, I will detail how do the theories stack up. I will detail the evidence for my theory in later chapters, but the following summarizes how well it stands up. For brevity, I will not compare faith in Christianity as a thesis, since God did it is not a scientific theory. That's a little, I guess maybe kind of insulting, but at this point, when you see that the rug is pulled out from under your eyes, you're going to have to wake up. But this is though part of a problem, like where he says, for the interest of brevity, there is absolutely nothing nothing brief about this book. Okay, so there's not much brief about me either. So I'm not one to talk, but okay, mythicism. The mythicist position is that there is no basis to accept a historical Jesus, or at least not one very similar to the story in the Gospels, and that Jesus' story was created by an unknown writer who built up Jesus' story by drawing on a collage of themes from a wide variety of religious stories from before Jesus' supposed lifetime. And he mentions that mythicism is not to be confused with Mithraism, which was a Roman secrecy cult popular from the 1st to 4th centuries, which included 7 grades of initiation. But for this cult, Christianity cult, the Flavian secrecy cult, he's only got really 4 levels. The Flavian secrecy cult, the theory that the Flavian government adapted Pauline literature. Now, so this is Menescot's point, is he believes that the Pauline literature is actually legitimate and that existed already. I don't know why he does that. I believe the only evidence that people believe that the Paul epistles were written before the Gospels is because Paul had an opportunity to refer to the Gospels and did not. Therefore, he wrote before them. I would strongly disagree with that. And several other of the authors who have written on this topic would as well. So the theory that the Flavian government adapted Pauline literature to create Jesus' gospel story so that it could be used in a Mithraism style secrecy cult, and that along with various previous deities, it primarily relates to the Flavian emperors who lived after Jesus' supposed lifetime. Within the cult, information that was carefully concealed within the Gospels would be revealed in stepwise fashion to initiates upon promotion to each level, to guide them along the following path. So this is similar to like the Masons or whatever. You go, first you're level 1, and then you go to level 2, and each time you are revealed like a new level of the secret. So, 1, follower of prophet and miracle worker Jesus. 2, worshiper of divine Son of God Jesus and Passover Lamb of God. 3, worshiper of Jesus who sees the Flavian emperor as the second coming, to see the Flavians as supreme gods and Jesus as secondary. 4, pure Flavian emperor worship, who sees Jesus as merely a fictional parable about Titus. The Gospels were created to convert commoners, especially Jews, and Roman soldiers to become loyal to the emperor and his descendants in perpetuity, to assure their hold on the throne and facilitate collection of taxes, fill the ranks of the legions, and prevent further revolts. Okay, now the explanatory power of the myth is, he says, minimal. It explains little, indeed none of the 15 curious aspects of first century history that I listed, which I read out 2 days ago at the end of the video. And for his theory, it has huge explanatory power. It explains all of the 15 curious aspects of first century history I listed, among others. Then the gaps in the explanation to be filled in the future, and starting assumptions needing to be accepted. Mythicism, huge gaps in the explanation. It suggests an unknown person of unknown location and background wrote Jesus' story based on myths selected for unknown reasons, and it was divided into synoptic stories for unknown reasons to meet a poorly understood objective. And then his thesis, one major assumption. Roman excellence in military strategy extended also to excelling in subtle and manipulative propaganda to such an extent that several historical sources, widely assumed to be independent, are actually propaganda masquerading as such, like Josephus, for example. And one minor assumption. Emperor Vespasian went beyond the usual desire for emperor worship by desiring sole emperor worship to protect his legacy, and he pushed his government propaganda teams to find a way to implement it. That second assumption doesn't seem to really jibe with what I know about Vespasian, at least. Given Caligula and Nero and Domitian, Tiberius, Vespasian is certainly not going to be the one who stands out for being kind of the most megalomaniacal. But that's kind of what he's saying, is that he's saying Vespasian went out beyond the usual desire for emperor worship. So he's way beyond all the rest of the emperors in terms of what he's trying to do, because he desires sole emperor worship, meaning that they worship only Vespasian. I would personally say that Vespasian probably had less to do with this than Titus did. But, again, and why would the second coming be to Titus instead of Vespasian most often? Occasionally it's to Vespasian, but usually Jesus' prophecies refer to Titus. So now the next section is testability or reproducibility. Somewhat testable regarding the very limited claims it makes under mythicism. The claim that Jesus' story is derivative of earlier myths can be tested, but not the assertion that this was the primary goal and that the thesis doesn't assert much else, so there isn't much more to test. And then in terms of his theory, the Flavian origin is completely testable. As will be described later, it is straightforward to demonstrate that the APTVS pattern is genuine, and Luke and Josephus have a common Flavian origin. Details of the Flavian strategy that are difficult to test, the proposed motivation for leaving us this evidence, and the proposed secrecy cult stages fit the evidence but are much harder to test. With greater testability and comparable gaps and assumptions, it is huge explanatory power which sets the Flavian secrecy cult hypothesis apart from mythicism and indeed all other competing theories. Let's see, he's just reading a couple footnotes. To be achieved by showing the evidence I will describe in this book that Jesus' life exactly mirrors the emperor life, and that the emperor's destruction of Jerusalem matches Jesus' prophecy about his second coming. And also revealing the evidence I will describe in this book that the Flavians were responsible for creating Jesus' story in the first place. Okay, now let's turn the page. Okay, the possible two-stage development of Jewish war. One thing that is fascinating about Jewish war, Josephus' book, otherwise known as Wars of the Jews, is how different the first and second half are from each other. So the Wars of the Jews is in 7 books. So when he says the first half and second half, I believe the first half that he's referring to are just the first 2 books. Maybe part of the 3rd book as well. And let's see where he goes from this. I'll start with the pattern itself. The parallels where Luke appears to parody Jewish war are mostly restricted to the second half. And the last 2 letters of the APTVS pattern, the VS, appear to be thicker and better defined. And you can see that if you take a look at the thumbnail for the video. The APTVS pattern is outlined there. But the differences continue everywhere you look. The document is entitled War of the Jews, or Jewish War, referring to the Great War of AD 66 to 74. But it is only the second half of the document that discusses this. The first half is about the previous century of conflict. So like the first half is kind of a lead-in to the actual events that is the title of the story, the Jewish War. But you can also look at it as, you know, this war, the 150 years before this, there were a lot of insurrections and a lot of revolution, like small revolutions and skirmishes and stuff. So it certainly could be, you could be thinking of it as being like a continuation or setting the stage, or it's not just like a non sequitur or something. It's relevant, even though it's not covered by the title. So indeed, the first half has a different writing style too. The paragraphs are a bit shorter, and the story is rambling and full of gossip, often regarding Herod and his wives. Sometimes it gives the impression of an author filling space. I also see the differences in the style of the parallels. In the second half, we find most of the stellar parallels and a far greater tendency for really interesting parallels that are effectively riddles. He showed one of those the other day, which was pretty effective. I mean, it was like just one paragraph of text, and there were like 6 parallels embedded in it. But you couldn't, even if you just read the 2 right next to each other, you still have to be looking for the parallels to dig them out. They were just really incredibly effectively hidden in the text. I mean, whoever put that together had to have put a great deal of care into it. So, greater tendency for really interesting parallels that are effectively riddles. In the first half, the quality of the parallels is generally a bit lower, and there is a notable absence of many stellar parallels. Now, the other way you could look at this is that Josephus was kind of just getting warmed up in the first book. He's kind of just figuring out how to write this in these riddles. And by the time he got to the second half, he got good at it. So not only does the first half give the impression of being a rushed effort, but the parallels are of a nature that could be achieved if you only had editorial control over Jewish war. Meaning that the first half of Jewish war was written after the Gospels were written, whereas the first half of the Jewish war was written at the same time. Whereas the parallels in the second half show real depth and creativity of a sort necessitating editorial control over both documents. So, meaning written at the same time by the same people. I would even go as far as predicting that if an authorship analysis could be done, much of the first half would turn out to be written by a different hand than the second half. That is very interesting. Now, he's poured over Jewish war a hell of a lot more than I have. I mean, I've read it, but, not with the kind of detail that I would need to really, part of it, I was just trying to get through it. It's not an easy read, and, but he's thinking that they were written by different people. And that's certainly, I'd say I'm certainly not going to discount that. Okay, to me, this whole line of thinking, though, it's kind of, just for me, it's not really that relevant. I mean, for me, it's important. The most important thing to understand is that the Romans wrote the Gospels. Which Romans? Not exactly sure. The Roman Caesars, a representative of the Caesars. Whether it was Josephus, and whether Josephus was an alias and it was really Arius Piso, or whether it was Titus or Vespasian or Domitian or Pliny the Younger, or who it was, Cicero the Younger, is not as important to me as that it was a Roman or a group of Romans. Titus, Tiberius Alexander, or Bernice. All of these people are high suspects to have written all or part of Jewish war. But to me, it doesn't really matter that much which one of them it is. And I don't think it really matters that much to most people. So, I'm hoping, I know he's going to flesh out most of the story eventually, but I feel like he's getting a little bit too in the weeds, into the details here, and I wish he would just present his evidence for the Roman provenance of the Gospels, because his evidence is overwhelming, and I think he gets overwhelmed himself by the evidence, and then points it into this thesis that is maybe separating him from all of the other scholars who have written on the fact that the Romans wrote the Gospels, which there's only, two handfuls, rather than just kind of lumping himself in with them all. Because it's not like Joseph Atwill's book is so-called a bestseller, but it's pretty much unknown. I hardly know anybody who's read Joseph Atwill's Caesar's Messiah or Shakespeare's Secret Messiah, even though it was a bestseller. It's not in the popular consciousness, really. He's getting there, but I would rather he would have presented it that way, because I feel like we'll figure out eventually who wrote it, but we need to have more momentum just in the idea that the Romans did write it, and that you can't do a deep dive on the Bible by reading the Bible. You got to do a deep dive on what is the Bible, where did it come from, who wrote it, what was the motivation, when was it written, all these things. Not, I do a deep dive on the Bible that's circular reasoning, doing a deep dive on the Bible by reading the Bible. You need to read the Bible too, but you need to figure out what is this thing that I'm reading. And if you are tempted to say this is the Word of God, well, then you need to get your head examined and kind of like get with reality. Or you can just believe that, if that's what you want. But this channel is not for you, if that's the case. Okay, the idea that the surviving copy of Jewish War was Titus's second version. So he's saying the Jewish War begins with an introduction stating that it is a translation of an earlier version written in the paternal tongue. I thought that was curious. I thought it was referring to Chaldee as the paternal tongue. I think Whiston, the translator, told me that. This is at odds with modern analyses by linguistic experts who agree that this is simply false. I would like to see a citation for that, but I do not. The surviving version simply shows none of the telltale signs of being a translation. So how can we explain this contradiction and all these observations about the two halves being so different? Okay, that's interesting. We're going to get into this argument here tomorrow when we resume. But for now, thanks for tuning in, and have a